There's been some more heartening news from New South Wales this morning with only 4 new cases. We'll hear from other states and territories throughout the day on their figures. Contrast that with the US, where that daily death toll is still huge. 2 days ago, 2,500 people died, and just in the last 24 hours in the US, at least another 2,000 reported dead. So still huge challenges there. So today's developments in our coronavirus coverage. The National Cabinet will today discuss a staged relaxation of restrictions. Changes are expected to be introduced 4 weeks at a time to allow medical experts to assess the impact on infection rates. More details are emerging about this Melbourne meatworks cluster with a high school student testing positive. A WorkSafe employee who visited the site is also being tested. The cluster has 62 cases. A further 3.2 million Americans have applied for unemployment just this week, taking the total to 33 million since the middle of March. Meanwhile, the UK is headed for its deepest recession in 300 years. Brazil has reported 615 virus deaths, the highest one-day tally in the southern hemisphere. Photos show how quickly mass graves have been filling on the outskirts of São Paulo. And the AFL is investigating whether several Adelaide Crows players broke the rules by training in a group. 16 players and an assistant coach are in quarantine at a Barossa Valley hotel. So let's take a look at some of those elements in detail now. Australians will today learn what their lives will look like in the months ahead as National Cabinet meets to chart a roadmap out of this coronavirus crisis. The Prime Minister, along with state and territory leaders, will finalise a framework that will outline how restrictions can be wound back. Political reporter Steph Boris joins us now from Parliament House in Canberra. Steph, g'day. So what can be expected from today?
Baby steps, Joe. There are going to be no major changes to social distancing restrictions as of this weekend, rather a plan as to how we can expect to see changes occur over the next few months. So those restrictions that were put into place within days, they are going to take weeks, if not months, to be wound back. This framework that National Cabinet will finalise today essentially outlines the plan for the months ahead. So what will happen is a few social distancing restrictions will be wound back, some businesses will reopen, and then those states and territories will have to wait 4 weeks before further changes can be made. The reason for that timeline is to allow authorities to see if there is an increase in coronavirus cases and whether the easing of restrictions is causing more harm than good or whether it's going really well. So what we can expect to see initially is things such as outdoor gatherings being allowed, or potentially a slight increase in the number of people that can go and visit another home, and also the reopening of some businesses. But with this framework, while it provides a roadmap, really is up to the states and territories as to when they introduce these changes. And that's all around the number of coronavirus cases that the states and territories have. So, for example, at the moment, Joe, in the Northern Territory, there are a lot more freedoms there than there are in New South Wales and Victoria. And that, of course, is due to the number of active cases.
And Steph, what can you tell us about this meeting of international leaders that Scott Morrison was a part of overnight?
Well, this is a group that every country wants to be part of. It's being dubbed the First Movers Group, and it's a group of countries that have done relatively well in keeping the number of coronavirus cases low and is now looking at ways to essentially reopen their economies. So the members of this group include Austria, there's also Israel, Norway, the Czech Republic. Australia has been invited to be part of this group, and the Prime Minister joined a conference call last night where all these leaders discussed the different ways they're trying to move forward. The key points here obviously being that these countries want to get their economies going again, but they don't want to see a second wave of coronavirus cases.
And Steph, just on another issue, yesterday we had this news about the superannuation scheme that's been introduced through this pandemic, where people are able to access their superannuation early if they're really struggling. What's the development with that story today?
Yeah, so as you mentioned there, you can access your super if you are struggling financially of up to $10,000 this financial year and next financial year. Yesterday we heard that someone has been accessing people's super and stealing their money. They've fraudulently been able to do this. Today, confirmation that it's a tax agent. Their system has been hacked, and as a result the personal details have been stolen, and those details have then been used to access people's super. The Federal Police police are investigating. They believe up to 150 Australians could have fallen victim to this scam that's going on. Also today we've learnt that the ATO has actually stopped accepting applications for people that want to access their super early while this investigation is going underway, just to ensure that their mechanisms and processes are super tight so that no further instances of this can occur.
Okay, Stephanie Boris there in Canberra. Now, the ramifications of a coronavirus outbreak at a Melbourne meatworks is growing, with a high school student now linked to the facility testing positive. Reporter Steph Ferrier joins us now from Melbourne. Steph, g'day. So what can you tell us about the latest on this Melbourne meatworks?
Yes, good morning, Joe. Well, this cluster at Cedar Meats just keeps growing. We've had confirmation from the Victorian Health Department that a student from Marcellin College in Bulleen in Melbourne's northeast has tested positive to coronavirus. Now, this particular boy, who was at a secondary school, a boys' Catholic college, was a household contact of a previously known and confirmed case from Cedar Meats. And the health department says that because this particular student wasn't at school when he was infectious, because of course we are in remote learning at the moment, that means that no further action needs to be taken by Marcellin College there. Now, this follows WorkSafe Victoria's confirmation as well that one inspector is being tested for coronavirus as a result of visiting the Cedar Meats facility in late April to investigate a workplace-related injury. Now, the WorkSafe department says that this particular inspector hasn't shown any signs or symptoms of coronavirus, but is self-isolating at home while they await these results as a precaution. And that's also forced the quarantining of 5 of the inspector's colleagues as well. And of course, David Littleproud, the Federal Agriculture Minister, also mentioned that 4 federal inspectors also visited that site, but did not get told or warned officially about the outbreak, but rather heard it through gossip. Now, the Cedar Meats cluster has now grown to 62, and most of those are workers, except of course a few cases like this student, as well as a nurse and an aged care worker.
And Steph, we've got this national cabinet meeting starting in an hour or so. What's the Victorian government had to say about easing restrictions?
Yes, well, Victoria has some of the toughest restrictions in the nation, and it's been labelled as being one of the most cautious states or territories in this whole crisis. And Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews has been pretty resolute about not wanting to lift any of these restrictions or announce any easing of the restrictions until the state of emergency here expires on Monday, and that's when he'll give some indication. Now, this heavy restriction also involves basically not continuing with school. Of course, we've still got remote learning at this stage for all of term 2. People are being urged to stay at home and only go into work if they absolutely have to. We also have outside visits really limited to getting essential supplies, as well as exercising only with a maximum of 2 people here. And things that other states can do, like golf or tennis, is not able to be done here in Victoria. So we don't know whether or not the Premier will come out after National Cabinet and say anything, but we're expecting not to hear any details about potentially restrictions being eased until Monday. However, of course, we have been in the middle of this really big testing blitz with more than 106,000 Victorians already tested. That's more than an MCG's worth of people. And besides the cluster, which the Health Department says is known and contained at Cedar Meats, the flushing out, I guess, of some of those unknown cases, well, it's been really far and few between. So that's probably some really positive news that the Health Department has, and that data set should clear the way for potentially some easing of these social restrictions.
Okay, Stephanie Ferrier reporting there from Melbourne. There are 4 new coronavirus infections in New South Wales this morning, bringing the state's total number of cases to around 3,050. One is a staff member at Newmarch House, a nursing home in Western Sydney. Premier Gladys Berejiklian is urging anyone with symptoms to come forward for testing.
Dr. Chant and I have been asking people to come forward and get tested, and in the last 24-hour batch we had more than 9,400 people come forward and get tested, another outstanding result. Please remember, if you have the slightest symptoms, if you think you might have the cold, please come forward and get tested. You could have the virus, and we need to make sure we recognise and identify anyone with the virus so that we can stop the spread. And out of those 9,400 cases, there were only tests, there were only 4 additional cases overnight. So again, a very pleasing result. I want to thank the community for your patience, but also for heeding the advice we're giving, because as we ease restrictions, the more people that come forward and get tested, the better our ability to monitor the spread, but also to consider further restrictions being eased. As I've been saying, in May we see schools go back next week, and I'm very pleased with the reports we're getting on the readiness of our schools for next week. So we've got extra cleaning in place, we've got extra supplies that have been provided, and of course extra information for parents, teachers and principals to make sure the transition back to school is as smooth as possible, because we want to make sure face-to-face teaching every day for all students happens as quickly as we can in New South Wales. We also appreciate the increase in the number of shops that are opening their doors, and we welcome that, but we ask both the managers of those stores but also the customers to make sure you practice good social distancing when you're in those stores. Make sure you wash your hands before and after, make sure that you keep the distance that's been recommended, and make sure you do approach your activity as safely as possible. And of course, with Mother's Day and another weekend coming along, we know that there'll be more visitations to people's houses, and we ask people to do that safely, especially if you're visiting an older person, a vulnerable person. Please consider how you might conduct that visit to keep everybody safe.
Now, pressure to reopen the US economy continues to mount after the release of data showing 30 million Americans have sought unemployment benefits since March. A further 3.2 million people have applied for payments this week. Economists believe official jobless figures due to be released later today could reach 15% for April. 2 months ago, unemployment in the US was at a 50-year low, down to just 3.5%. And the Trump administration has shelved a document created by the top public health institute in the US setting out how to safely reopen the economy. It comes as one of the president's close contacts tests positive for coronavirus. Here's North America correspondent Catherine Diss.
From what we understand, this 17-page report, which was pulled together by the CDC, it detailed some fairly detailed advice as to how to reopen places like schools, restaurants and churches. It was meant to be released last Friday, but from some reports from scientists who were involved in pulling that guidance together, they have since been told that it will never see the light of day after the Trump administration chose to shelve it. Now, historically, the CDC has played a significant role in distributing this kind of guidance to the public during a pandemic. It has not done so in the case of the coronavirus. The White House has decided to tightly control the messaging that it puts out to the public via its coronavirus task force, which, as we know, was headed or is headed by the Vice President Mike Pence. We know that the President has wanted to get the economy back up and running as quickly as it possibly can be. So perhaps this guidance, which was fairly detailed and really laid out a step-by-step process, was going to somewhat slow that process. One of the most prominent charges brought by the Special Counsel Robert Mueller, Michael Flynn, pleaded guilty in December 2017 for lying to the FBI about his dealings with his Russian contacts during the transition to the Trump administration, but Department of Justice officials, including the Attorney General William Barr, have today decided that in light of some new evidence recently disclosed that the FBI's questioning of him just 4 days after President Trump was inaugurated as the president lacked any sort of proper investigative basis. The court documents that were filed today by the Justice Department said that the FBI's interview interview of Flynn was untethered and unjustified by the FBI's counterintelligence investigation into him, and it concluded that the interview was without any legitimate investigative basis. So this was a fairly short, sharp end to what did become a fairly lengthy, protracted legal debacle in which Flynn changed his defence team and also changed his guilty plea.